Well, I've already talked about the worst horror films I've ever seen and the worst remakes I've ever seen, so now I get to reward myself by talking about what I consider to be my favorite horror films. So, just sit back and enjoy. These are my top 13 favorite horror films of all time. Before Jason was slicing and dicing campers and sequels, crossovers, and a god-awful remake, Sean Cunningham gave us a simple horror movie about camp counselors being murdered by, well, let's just say someone else for those who have been living under a rock for over 30 years. What Cunningham and writer Victor Miller accomplished so well in this film was a sense of anonymity for the killer. All the kills, before the big reveal in the end, are done using the killer's POV, and the movie never once even hints at the killer's identity. It's all shrouded in mystery, as all of the counselors are dispatched one at a time. Now, POV was done in other horror movies like Halloween, but to my knowledge, never the whole time. This movie kept us on our toes simply because the killer could be anyone, and thusly, anyone could be next. Another thing this movie does so well is the power of suggestion. Some deaths are implied instead of actually shown. There's one scene where the next victim is running through the rain in the dark. She has no idea where she is at this point, but you can pretty much guess her fate for yourself when the light goes on. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Scenes like this prove that you don't really need to see the kill for yourself in order to experience the horror, and that's something I felt all the sequels seriously missed out on. Death and gruesomeness can be implied and hinted at, and in the end, the horror of it all will still be present. By the standards of today, the plot of this film is the definition of standard. A group of teenagers are visiting a family grave in Texas, come across a house, they end up getting slaughtered, insert any horror movie cliche you would like here. However, what makes this film so damn good and impressive is how Tobe Hooper directed it. This film is a horrific marvel of visual imagery. The macabre of this film will last in your brain long after it's ended. I'll never forget the bed made out of bones, the masks made out of skin, the whole cannibalistic scene at the dinner table, the meat hook scene which makes me cringe every time I sit through it. This film is not only scary with its imagery, but incredibly memorable with it. It knows what to give its audience without ever revealing too much, until the very end. It's hinted at what these killers are, but we never get a clear indication until the dinner table scene, where everything becomes clear to us. Personally, I don't think this film should have ever been turned into a franchise. It's a perfect standalone horror film, and there was no reason to ever try and top it. Or remake it. Or do a prequel. Or a direct sequel after all the other sequels. Or the prequel to this film that has officially been announced. My God, just stop. Just stop. One of the highest-grossing independent films of all time, Halloween was highly inspired by the works of Alfred Hitchcock, a director that John Carpenter very much admired in his youth, and boy does it show here, as Carpenter hits every note and staple of Hitchcock's work perfectly. The film, about three babysitters who fall victim to an escaped killer on Halloween night, worked so well mainly because it was set in a typical setting. It wasn't set in some Texas wasteland, some far-off motel, or an isolated camp, but rather right in the middle of suburbia, in a simple town. This makes the setting relatable and thus helps the characters seem more relatable. It showed that something like this can happen anywhere. It's not just reduced to horror fantasy, but could also be seen in reality. The three female leads are all seen as independent, funny, and interesting. We know what's probably going to happen, but the characters are so likable that you don't want anything to happen, and the suspense only deepens as the film goes on. There are scenes where you expect the killer, Michael Myers, to pop up and kill someone, but John Carpenter goes the extra mile, and in some scenes does something unexpected. Something you just didn't see coming, and that's a great thing. When I'm watching a horror film, I want shit to be unexpected. I don't want to sit there predicting everything. Jamie Lee Curtis is great in this movie, but the performance that steals the show is the late Donald Pleasence as Dr. Loomis.
15 years ago, I was told there was nothing left. No reason, no conscience, no understanding, and even the most rudimentary sense of life or death, of good or evil, right or wrong. I met this 6-year-old child with this blank, pale, emotionless face and the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes. I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up, because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
This was an actor who loved playing this character so much that he continued to do it until the day he died, long after the series had then become ridiculous and embarrassing with its long beret of unnecessary, yet not all bad, sequels. Halloween is a horror classic, and for damn good reason. Long before Stephen King fans were too busy talking about The Shining being overrated, director Brian De Palma gave us this big screen adaptation of King's first novel about an unpopular, tormented teenage girl who develops telekinetic powers, much to the dismay of her disgusting religious mother. I will admit something about this film now. It does bother me that De Palma, for some of the movie, disregards the social commentaries of King's novel in favor of just making a scary horror film. But in the end, he succeeded in making a scary horror film that was not only terrifying, but very memorable. And while I would have liked to see more of the bullying put into the film, thank you, it is still there. It's not like De Palma sideswept it completely. The horror of this film and of the book comes simply from an idea. The idea of what happens when you push someone too far. In this case, a girl with telekinetic abilities, who in the end goes on a crazy rampage, and the lead up to it is just wonderful. Sissy Spacek delivers a memorable and chilling performance as a young girl pushed to the breaking point, and not just from her mean classmates, but also from her batshit insane religious mother. This all leads to a shocking finale at a school prom where Carrie decides that she's finally had enough, letting her inner demons and built-up rage finally come to light. So, if there's any movie that could scare you into being nice to the weird girl at school, this is it. Or, you could act like a nice human being, just be nice to her because you're not a fucking dick. That would help too. Anyone who has seen my reviews in the past can tell you that I love the work of Tim Burton, and I have loved his rendition of Sleepy Hollow since the day I saw it in theaters. Many have dismissed this film simply because it doesn't follow the book. But, at the risk of much hate mail, I never liked the book. I know, just hear me out. I actually remember being quite bored by it when I read it in high school, and I also remember viewing Ichabod Crane as being kind of an asshole. If you like it, I think that's great. To each their own. It just wasn't intriguing to me personally. Andrew Kevin Walker, the writer of Seven, wrote this film, and I liked the idea of turning the story into a murder mystery. Ichabod Crane is no longer a selfish asshole schoolteacher, and is instead made to be a kind, good-hearted investigator, who comes to Sleepy Hollow in hopes of finding a killer. What he stumbles across instead is a conspiracy involving the Headless Horseman, and must now track down whoever is controlling the Hessian in order to stop the murders. This movie plays heavily to Burton's strengths, allowing for some intense atmosphere and horrifying imagery. The set designs are breathtaking. Even if I didn't like the plot or the characters in this movie, I would watch it on mute and just sit there in awe, gazing at how amazing this movie looks. That's really where the horror comes from, and why I do consider it one of my favorite horror films. It's so rich with creepy atmosphere that each time I watch it, I am always on the edge of my seat. And lest we forget that badass Christopher Walken image.
Black steed named Daredevil. He was infamous for riding his horse hard into battle, chopping off heads at full gallop. He'd file his teeth down to sharp points to add to the ferocity of his appearance.
Oh, fuck yeah. No more cowbell needed. That's just brilliant. Performances in the film are great all around. I would even argue that this is one of Johnny Depp's finest performances. The blood and the sets are one big send-up to the days of Hammer horror. Hell, even some of the casting is. The imagery is great, the atmosphere is great, the acting is great, the writing was interesting to say the least, and Tim Burton delivers on gory decapitations tenfold. Sleepy Hollow remains one of my favorite horror films and one of my favorite Tim Burton films. Yeah, let's just forget that dog shit remake and just focus on the original for a moment. Remember how your mother always said never pick up a hitchhiker? Well, this movie is the fucking poster child for that timeless statement. A young teenager played by C. Thomas Howell picks up a hitchhiker on the side of the road. The Hitcher, played brilliantly by Rutger Hauer, then begins to toy with him and threatens his life until the teen finds a way to kick him out of his car. Literally. The rest of the movie is a game of cat and mouse as the Hitcher pursues the young man relentlessly trying to kill him. The scary part about this is really that this can happen to anyone. Rutger Hauer's character in this is sadistic and methodical. He has no reason to threaten lives or kill people. He just wants to because he can. It represents how any stranger can be a sadistic madman. One of my favorite scenes in the movie is a scene towards the end. Spoiler alert, where the Hitcher has somebody tied up between two trucks, with only his foot on the brake to keep from splitting this person in half. Whereas in the remake we see all the gruesome details and it isn't at all scary, in this film it cuts to something else before the inevitable happens, leaving us to wonder what it would have looked like. The situation alone is horrifying. I don't need to actually see it happen to know it happened, or to be completely freaked out by it, because I was. I remember having to turn the movie off at that point, not because it was bad in any way, but because of how shocking it was. And any horror movie that can shock and surprise me to the point where I had to take a break from it certainly deserves a spot on this list. I can't talk much about this one, as revealing too much might actually ruin the surprising experience for those who haven't seen it, but talk about an overlooked, underrated, and extremely underappreciated horror film. April Fool's Day takes you by surprise so much, especially in the climax, and to date remains one of the most inventive slashers I've ever seen. I mean, my god, what a perfect ending. But I'm getting way ahead of myself here. The film revolves around... well, it's an 80s slasher film, so what else? A group of college kids going to a remote location and getting the axe one by one. Seems pretty standard at first, but when you find out what's really happening, you will shit bricks. The film maintains a suspenseful tone throughout and takes some unexpected turns that only make the movie that much better. I think the reason this film is often overlooked is because it was made at a time when studios were just shelling out slasher film after slasher film in hopes of duplicating Paramount's success with Friday the 13th. I mean, seriously, everyone was making these movies back then, and the most they had to pay for was the blood and makeup. It was insane. So, in retrospect, I think April Fool's Day just got lost among the crowd, and it is a shame. Like I said, I can't say too much without revealing major things in the film, so all I'm gonna say is seek it out and see for yourself what you've been missing. For number 6, I unfortunately had to tie up 2 older horror films because I love both of these movies so much with all my heart, and I just can't leave either one off of here. Funny enough, both movies were released from rival directors. The first film is Psycho, directed by the master of suspense himself, Alfred Hitchcock. This film about a woman who falls victim to a killer in the Bates Motel was so iconic that it remained until the day he died Hitchcock's most popular and profitable film. And why not? It's suspenseful, it's horrifying, the shower scene is iconic, and the end was so memorable that many other directors would later rip it off with shockingly bad results. The performances by Anthony Perkins, Vera Miles, and Janet Leigh are astounding. There is not a bad note of acting between the three of them. Being the master of suspense, Hitchcock understood the value of a slow burn, building characters, building story, and constantly keeping the suspense moving to an insane conclusion that left moviegoers in awe. Take notes, Ty West, take notes. The second film at number 6 is House on Haunted Hill, directed by William Castle. A rival with Hitchcock for years, what separated them was that Hitchcock was more about suspense and slow build-up, while Castle was more about the experience, immersing you in scary situations with good characters. Now you would think that because of this, House on Haunted Hill wouldn't have much suspense to it, but no, it's surprisingly the opposite. House on Haunted Hill thrives on suspense, but also gives you the unforgettable experience that Castle was famous for creating. The whole story is about a man played by Vincent Price, who invites several people to a supposedly haunted house to see if it is really haunted. However, unlike in the remake where they flat out say the place is haunted, in this, it's all the power of suggestion. There is evidence to support that the house is haunted, however, there is another plot brewing within the house that throws you off, leaving you to wonder if everything was just a hoax. It's actually kind of fascinating as you never know where the story will go or what will happen next. Again, it's pretty much all suggestion, but probably the best thing about this movie is Vincent Price. Price was a titan of acting, and in House on Haunted Hill, he takes every advantage to be as memorable and creepy as possible, and I would expect no less from such a talent. Psycho and House on Haunted Hill, two films so good, I just can't choose between them. Unlike most horror films back then that relied on gore and teenagers being slaughtered, John Carpenter relied on mounting tension and intense atmosphere to make The Fog one of the most memorable horror films of all time. This is a creepy ghost story that explores the concepts of revenge and American greed. Something happened in the town of Antonio Bay years ago, and now the descendants are forced to pay the price as a fog rolls in, filled with entities bent on revenge. What starts out as a supernatural ghost story quickly becomes an all-out fight for survival, as the town's residents must find out what the fog is after and how to stop it. Jamie Lee Curtis, Tom Atkins, and Adrienne Barbeau do wonderful jobs selling the fear of this movie. I mean, it's a glowing fog, you have to sell it as scary somehow. This film is eerie and oozing with tension throughout its runtime, and almost never lets up on it. It slowly builds to its climax rather than rushing towards it, and pays off beautifully when the film finally ends. It's a great ghost story with interesting ideas and a great deal of heart. Long before we were given this Babe-ortion remake, we had the original scary as hell classic, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Wes Craven actually showed more creativity by making his slasher icon Freddy Krueger a deceased killer, who now slaughters children in their dreams as a burned nightmare-driven dream demon. Robert Englund remains iconic for this performance, sporting menace, fear, and a sense of personality all in one. Other actors also do great work in this film. Heather Langenkamp, Amanda Weiss, John Saxon, Johnny Depp. Yeah, this was actually Johnny Depp's first movie, and at the risk of spoilers, he has the best death scene in the movie. How the hell there was that much blood flowing through Johnny Depp's body, I'll never fucking know, but it looks cool as hell. I'll allow it. The movie would eventually get a string of unnecessary sequels, but the original still stands on its own as an entirely original, creative, and unique vision of horror, and remains my favorite slasher film to date. Just to give you a little perspective, I saw this movie in theaters with my dad. My dad grew up on horror movies. He does not get scared by horror movies. At all. This is the man who once told me that John Carpenter's The Thing is for pussies. Carpenter's horror masterpiece couldn't even scare this guy. When we went and saw Sinister, he was shaking and scared shitless throughout the entire film. And so was I. That is how effective this movie was. It scared a man that I have never seen be scared in my entire life. But you know what? Enough about my dad being a pussy. Let's just talk about Sinister for a minute. What is it about this film that makes it so effective? Well, let's look at the story. A washed-up author, played by Ethan Hawke, moves his family into a house where a family was murdered, hoping to write a bestseller about the murder that plagues this small town. What he comes across involves sacrifice and an ancient demon known as Bagul, the eater of children. The atmosphere in this film is gorgeous. Okay, there are times when you sit there asking why Ethan Hawke doesn't just turn on the lights, but the scenes themselves are so creepy that I didn't even think about that until watching it a few more times. What adds to the atmosphere and the creepy storyline is the soundtrack. The soundtrack consists of noises that are unsettling and eerie, and it only helps to make every scene that much more effective. I also love the fact that I didn't know where this movie was going. It covers its tracks rather well, and the ending was so damn creepy, I turned to my dad when it was over and begged him not to let my youngest sibling visit that weekend. Needless to say, that weekend I was sleeping with a carving knife, but I digress. This is a film with an original storyline, good character development, a horrifying soundtrack, an intense atmosphere, and genuinely scary moments that stick with you long after it's over. I know I'm in a minority on this one, as a lot of people prefer Insidious, a movie I did not find scary. At all. But to each their own, I guess. Haters gonna hate. This has got to be one of the most original and disturbing horror films I have ever seen, and I think it's a shame how much the film is overlooked. Especially since it was the inspiration for one of the most beloved horror video game franchises of all time. The film is about a Vietnam War veteran played by Tim Robbins, suffering from dissociation while simultaneously mourning the loss of his only child. He attempts to uncover parts of his past that he can't remember, but finds doing this rather difficult, as he also suffers from serious delusions and can't seem to decipher or separate these delusions from reality. And thus, it makes it hard for us to decipher delusions from reality. There are scenes in this film that send chills down my spine no matter how much I watch them. The scene with the nurses, the Vietnam flashbacks, hell, the scene on the train towards the beginning of the film gives me goosebumps every time. Now, everything he is experiencing is explained in the end, and, well, I'm not gonna lie to you, it's one of those endings you're either going to really love or really hate. Hell, if you're like me, you might actually have to sit through it a couple times just to understand the ending. I personally loved it and felt it wrapped up Jacob's living nightmare rather nicely, but I certainly understand those who don't. To me, Jacob's Ladder is beautifully acted, beautifully directed, and features some of the most frightening visual imagery I have ever witnessed. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you do. Yes, for those who don't know, Alien is my favorite horror film, and to date remains my favorite work from director Ridley Scott. The film revolves around the team in space who are given a detour from their route home to investigate a distress signal from an unknown craft. When they enter the craft, they are forced to bring an alien stowaway on board when it attaches itself to one of the crew members' faces. Something happens and the alien gets free on the ship, forcing the rest of the crew to now fight for their very lives. Alien is a haunted house in space that never gets old. That scene of Dallas in the air shaft knowing that the alien could pop up anywhere gets me every time. I'm always on the edge of my seat during that scene, and I always jump when the alien pops up. I've seen the movie countless times. I still jump at that scene. It's fucking scary, damn it. The atmosphere in the film is the best I've seen in any horror film, and once the alien gets loose, the tension never once lets up. The story and character building is flawless. The film spends the first 45 minutes building tension, setting up likable and memorable characters with distinct personalities, who are all done justice by the terrific actors playing them. Tom Skerritt, John Hurt, Ian Holm, Nancy Cartwright, Yaphet Kotto, Harry Dean Stanton, and of course, my favorite actress ever, Sigourney Weaver. All of them are wonderful. You don't want any of them to die, and you care what happens to every single one of them. There is not a single bad character moment between them. Every scene is directed and acted with precision and perfect timing. To date, this is one of the best acting ensembles ever put on screen. Every scene, and I mean every scene with the alien, is memorable and scary as shit. Every time I see it, I notice something new, whether it be something in the background or just a facial expression given by one of the characters. Alien is the best and most memorable horror film I have ever seen, and I look forward to being scared by it many more times years down the line.
I can't lie to you about your chances, but you have my sympathies.